Quito knew what it meant to be invisible. He had walked the savannah alone for years, blending with the land, surviving where few dared to live. But that day, when he saw a foreign man, far from the safety of his luxury, stepping into the most dangerous part of the wilderness, Quito had no idea that his life was about to change forever. At first, he thought it was just another tourist, another man who believed that money could protect him from nature. But then the growl came, a sound Quito knew too well. The phantom tiger, a beast whispered about in every village, feared by even the bravest. Hunters was real, and it was hunting. Quito could have turned away, could have let the man be a lesson in the arrogance of outsiders, but something inside him wouldn't let him run. So he stepped forward, with nothing but a branch, a spark, and the courage most adults never find in a lifetime. This isn't just a story of survival. It's the beginning of an unexpected bond between a boy who had nothing but his instincts, and a man who thought he could buy the world, but almost lost his life instead. Stay until the end. Because when Quito makes his final choice, it will remind you of what truly matters: courage, loyalty, and the power of a second chance. Now tell us, where are you watching from? Richard Langdon adjusted the cuff of his tailored shirt as he stepped down from the private aircraft, his polished boots crunching over the gravel of the remote airstrip. "Where's my guide?" he barked, glancing around with irritation. A thin man in khaki, holding a faded sign with Richard's name, approached quickly, extending a hand that Richard ignored. "Your vehicle is ready, sir," the guide announced with forced politeness. Richard barely acknowledged him, and instead focused on the matte black all-terrain vehicle parked nearby, its imposing tires caked in red dust from previous excursions. "Load my equipment," Richard ordered, popping the trunk of his designer luggage and pulling out a state-of-the-art camera. The guide, accustomed to these types, silently began stacking the gear. Richard climbed into the passenger seat, impatiently tapping his fingers against the dashboard. "Let's not waste time. I didn't come here for sightseeing brochures. I want the real Savanna." The guide hesitated, then mumbled, "Some areas are restricted. Very dangerous at this time of year." Richard shot him a dismissive look, smirking as he said, "Danger is precisely what I'm paying for." With that, he leaned back, ready for what he anticipated would be an exhilarating adventure, entirely oblivious to the gravity of his recklessness. As the vehicle rumbled along the rugged dirt track, Richard began assembling his camera, fitting the telephoto lens with practiced precision. "Stop here!" he commanded suddenly, spotting a small herd of antelope grazing just beyond the acacia trees. The guide obediently slowed, but before he could come to a full stop, Richard had already leapt out, crouching low and firing off a series of rapid shots. "Perfect," he whispered to himself, examining the images on the digital display. The guide watched from the vehicle, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. Richard stood up and exhaled loudly. "Not bad, but I want something wilder. Take me to where the real predators roam." The guide swallowed hard and shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, those areas are not recommended without backup." Richard waved his hand impatiently, signaling for the guide to get moving. As the vehicle lurched forward again, neither man noticed the dark eyes watching them from the nearby bushes. Quito crouched silently behind the thick foliage, his expression unreadable as he observed the foreigner moving deeper into a land he neither understood nor respected. Quito's fingers tightened around the small wooden talisman hanging from his neck, a keepsake from his late father who had once warned him about the folly of outsiders who believed money could shield them from nature's laws. His bare feet shifted soundlessly across the uneven terrain as he shadowed the vehicle from a safe distance, blending effortlessly into the landscape he knew intimately. He had seen many like Richard before, men with expensive gear and arrogant attitudes, seeking to conquer the wild with their technology and bravado. But something about this man's presence felt different, more intrusive, more defiant. Quito resisted the urge to shake his head in disbelief as he noticed the vehicle veering towards a narrow path that twisted sharply away from the established routes. Every child in the nearby village knew that trail was taboo, marked by countless stories of disappearances and unseen predators. Yet, there was Richard, urging his guide to push forward, oblivious to the risks he was inviting upon himself. "Why aren't we going further?" Richard demanded, glaring at the guide as they approached the start of the forbidden trail. The guide's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "This trail is closed off." "Dangerous," he insisted, his voice firmer this time. Richard scoffed, leaning closer and lowering his voice to a condescending whisper. "Do you want your tip or not?" The guide hesitated, his internal conflict visible, but finally sighed and turned the wheel, directing the vehicle slowly onto the overgrown path. Branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle as they advanced, the trail narrowing ominously with each meter. Quito quickened his pace to keep up, moving agilely through the dense underbrush. He knew every twist and turn of this trail, every hidden hollow where predators lurked, waiting for foolish prey. And now, for reasons even he couldn't quite explain, he felt compelled to follow them, to see what recklessness would lead them to this time. Inside the vehicle, Richard shifted his position, raising his camera again as the landscape became increasingly untamed. The orderly expanse of grassland had given way to tangled thickets and jagged rocks. "This is more like it," he said smugly, snapping photos of the encroaching wilderness. The guide, however, said nothing, his eyes darting nervously to every shadow that passed. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy composing shots, capturing the raw aesthetic he believed would enhance his latest travel documentary. "Look at this, untouched," he muttered, snapping another shot. Quito, keeping low among the reeds, narrowed his eyes as he watched Richard carelessly step out of the vehicle again, camera in hand, turning his back on the path ahead. The boy's instincts screamed at him. This was not the place for posing or pictures. Something unseen stirred further down the trail, something that even Quito did not yet fully understand, but felt deep in his bones. Richard called out to the guide without turning around. "Get a photo of me standing here, something that says untamed." The guide reluctantly climbed out, raising Richard's secondary camera. "Hurry up!" Richard urged, standing with his arms stretched wide against the backdrop of the thick, twisted vegetation. The guide framed the shot quickly, eager to return to the relative safety of the vehicle. Quito remained hidden but tense, scanning the perimeter beyond where Richard stood. He spotted a set of broken branches and disturbed foliage just off the trail, unmistakable signs that something large had recently passed through. Quito's jaw clenched. He recognized the markings. Only a predator with immense strength could have moved through there, snapping thick branches as if they were twigs. His gaze flicked back to Richard, who was obliviously reviewing the photos, praising his own appearance while completely unaware of how close he was standing to imminent danger. As Richard strutted back toward the vehicle, he paused to admire the depth of the trail. They had carved into the wilderness. "See, this is what I wanted, not those boring guided tours with their predetermined routes. This is authenticity," he boasted. The guide forced a weak smile, still visibly uncomfortable. Richard waved dismissively and climbed back into the vehicle, ordering the guide to continue even further along the unmarked trail. Quito, crouching behind a termite mound, let out a silent breath, his mind racing with whether or not he should intervene. He had promised himself never to get involved with these tourists. They never listened, never respected the land. But something about the recklessness of this man and the growing danger on this path made Quito hesitate. He shifted position, deciding to follow them a little longer, at least until he could be certain of what was lurking beyond the next bend. The vehicle rumbled forward, jolting violently as it crossed. Uneven terrain. Richard barely noticed, too consumed by checking the photos on his camera's screen, planning the captions he would post to his millions of social media followers. "This will make the front page of my site," he murmured proudly. The guide tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his gut twisting with every passing meter. The path ahead was no longer a trail, but a gauntlet, narrowing dangerously and flanked by thick brush that concealed whatever might lie beyond. Quito, now moving more swiftly through a parallel line of cover, recognized this portion of the land. It was close to a known predator's domain. He had seen evidence in the past, and his instincts told him that entering any deeper would be a mistake. But the vehicle showed no signs of stopping, and neither did Richard's arrogant pursuit of adventure. Quito bit his lip, then continued forward, unwilling to turn away. Just yet, without warning, the vehicle lurched to a halt as one of the front tires sank into a hidden rut, pitching the entire frame at an awkward angle. Richard cursed loudly, throwing open the door and stepping out to inspect the damage. "Unbelievable," he snapped, kicking the loose dirt in. Frustration. The guide climbed out as well, kneeling to assess the situation. "We need to back out carefully," the guide advised, wiping sweat from his brow. Richard dismissed him with a wave, already stepping further down the path, camera in hand, determined to scout ahead while the guide worked to maneuver the vehicle free. Quito, watching intently from the concealment of thick shrubs, inhaled sharply. He could see that Richard was walking straight toward an area known as the Silent Clearing, a place avoided by every local, not because of superstition, but because of what had been found there. Bones. Many bones. Quito adjusted his stance and prepared to move closer, realizing that the recklessness of the foreigner was about to lead him into the very heart of the Savanna's most lethal secrets. Richard pressed his boot into the dirt, pausing as his eyes locked onto the massive imprint before him. "Get over here," he snapped at the driver, waving him toward the ground. The driver approached reluctantly, his eyes darting between the impression and the surrounding brush, his entire posture tense. That's not from a lion," the driver muttered, kneeling beside the print and brushing away some of the loose dirt for a clearer view. Richard crouched next to him, examining the outline, his curiosity visibly piqued. "I've read about this. Locals say there's some kind of tiger out." "Here," Richard said, almost gleefully, his voice edged with excitement rather than fear. The driver swallowed hard, avoiding his employer's eyes. "They call it the phantom tiger. No one's seen it for years, but—" He paused, glancing nervously into the thick vegetation. Richard stood up abruptly, brushing off his hands and grinning. "That's exactly the kind of story I'm after. Imagine the headlines: American billionaire captures image of legendary beast." The driver didn't respond, but shifted his stance uneasily. Richard spun toward the vehicle. "Let's keep moving. This could be the opportunity of a lifetime." Without waiting for further discussion, he climbed back into the passenger seat. The driver hesitated for a moment, staring down at the print one last time before reluctantly getting behind the wheel. As he started the engine, Richard leaned over and said with mock reassurance, "Relax, if it hasn't been seen for years, chances are it's long gone or dead." The driver didn't respond, but the tight grip on the steering wheel betrayed his unease. They pushed further down the overgrown trail, the branches thickening around them with every passing meter. Richard continued scanning the terrain, his camera resting on his lap, finger poised over the shutter button. "This is perfect," he murmured to himself, already picturing the dramatic photos and interviews. The driver cleared his throat and said cautiously, "Sir, we're going very far from the safe routes. If something goes wrong out here, there's no immediate help." Richard snorted dismissively. "That's the point. I don't want the same photos as every tourist. I want something no one else has." The driver opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it, focusing instead on navigating the increasingly difficult path, while Quito continued his silent pursuit from the dense undergrowth, tracking the vehicle's every turn. Without warning, the vehicle jolted sharply as it hit a hidden dip in the path, causing Richard to clutch at the dashboard. "Watch it," he barked, glaring at the driver, who muttered an apology while trying to steady the wheel. Richard shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable! Do you even know how to drive this thing?" The driver bit back a retort, focusing on maneuvering around the exposed roots and jagged rocks that now littered the narrowing trail. Richard adjusted the settings on his camera, ready for the next potential sighting. His mind was fixed on the possibility of encountering the phantom tiger, blind to the warning signs that surrounded them. Quito, trailing carefully and keeping his body low, noticed the subtle changes in the environment. The fresh claw marks on a tree trunk, the way smaller animals had vacated the area completely. He recognized these indicators as clear evidence that a large predator had passed through recently, possibly very recently. Still, he pressed on, his instincts torn between wanting to witness what was unfolding and fearing the inevitable consequences of the foreigner's arrogance. As they approached a desolate clearing, the driver slowed the vehicle, his eyes wide with apprehension. "We shouldn't go any further," he said firmly, gripping the wheel as if it might anchor him against Richard's determination. Richard, ignoring him entirely, opened the door and stepped out, surveying the expanse before them. The clearing was devoid of movement, the grass trampled and broken in erratic patterns, as though something massive had passed through and left chaos in its wake. Richard raised his camera and began snapping photos, capturing every detail of the disturbed landscape. "This is exactly what I wanted," he said aloud, more to himself than to the driver, who remained seated, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Quito crept closer from the perimeter of the clearing, crouching behind a fallen log. From his vantage point, he could see that Richard had ventured dangerously close to a cluster of rocks where Quito himself had once found the remains of an antelope, its body torn apart in a manner no known local predator could achieve. He exhaled slowly, knowing that this man had no idea what he was walking into. Richard called over his shoulder, "Come take a look at this," gesturing for the driver to join him. The driver shook his head, remaining in the safety of the vehicle. Frustrated, Richard turned back to the clearing, determined to explore. Further on his own, he moved toward the rock cluster, camera still raised, snapping shots of every broken branch and overturned stone. "This is incredible," he whispered, crouching to get a better angle of a particularly large footprint embedded deeply in the soft earth. Quito, now only meters away, but still hidden, watched as Richard traced the edges of the print with his fingers, oblivious to the significance of what he was touching. Quito's gaze shifted slightly to the surrounding brush, where he noticed a fresh scrape on the bark of a nearby tree, evidence of a predator marking its territory. His heart pounded as he realized that the phantom tiger wasn't a myth to embellish tourist tales. It was real, and it had been here recently, perhaps still was. He debated whether to intervene or continue watching silently. As Richard stood up from his crouch, he adjusted the focus on his camera and pointed it toward the dense thicket beyond the rocks, zooming in on what appeared to be another set of tracks. "Look at this," he muttered to himself, snapping another series of photographs. Behind him, the driver finally gathered the courage to call out, "Sir, we should really leave now. This place, it's not safe." Richard chuckled without turning around. "You're letting superstitions get to you. There's no such thing as a ghost tiger." The driver sighed, but his eyes never stopped scanning the edges of the clearing, his instincts screaming that they shouldn't be here. Quito watched all of this unfold with growing dread. He knew that the deeper Richard ventured, the more likely it was that he would stumble directly into the predator's path. The boy's fingers twitched at his side, torn between his lifelong rule of never interfering with tourists and the undeniable certainty that this man was pushing himself into mortal danger. Determined to document everything, Richard walked further into the clearing, moving away from the relative safety of the vehicle and his reluctant guide. Each step took him closer to the center, where the grass was more violently trampled, and the earth showed deeper impressions of massive paws. He paused briefly, kneeling again to get another close-up shot. The driver called out more urgently this time, "Sir, please, we need to go." But Richard only waved him off, too consumed by the excitement of discovery to heed the warning. Quito shifted position, moving along the perimeter to keep Richard in sight while maintaining his concealment. His mind raced through every possibility, calculating how quickly he could intervene if necessary. He glanced toward a break in the brush where he had previously seen large animals emerge, wondering if today would be the same. But despite every instinct urging him to retreat, Quito stayed put, knowing that this man's fate was now irrevocably tied to his own silent vigilance. Just as Richard prepared to take yet another photograph, his lens captured something unexpected, a faint outline of what appeared to be a trail of blood, almost obscured by the tall grass, but unmistakable upon closer inspection. He adjusted the focus, snapping several images before standing abruptly. "There's something more here," he said aloud, moving quickly in the direction of the trail. The driver shouted, panic rising in his voice, "Sir, stop!" But Richard was already pushing through the grass, following the faint line as if it were a guidepost to his ultimate prize. Quito, now realizing that things were escalating beyond control, moved from his cover and began advancing parallel to Richard, keeping himself hidden but ready to act. He had seen such blood trails before. They didn't lead to adventure, they led to death. As Richard disappeared further into the dense grass, Quito made a silent vow. He would not let this man become another nameless victim of the Savanna's most feared predator. Quito's pace quickened as he kept Richard within sight, weaving through the undergrowth with practiced ease. He saw Richard pause at the edge of a shallow depression where the blood trail ended abruptly. Richard lowered his camera and took a cautious step forward, peering into the hollow. From his vantage point, Quito saw what Richard couldn't, a series of deep gouges in the earth, as if something massive had thrashed violently in its final moments. Richard crouched to examine the marks, completely unaware of the rustling movement just beyond the opposite ridge of the hollow. Quito's eyes widened as he detected the subtle, deliberate motion of a predator stalking from within the brush. He tightened his grip on the small knife strapped to his hip, his mind already racing through scenarios of how he could divert or confront the threat if it emerged. Richard, oblivious, raised his camera again for what he assumed would be another groundbreaking shot, while Quito prepared himself for the moment he feared was imminent, the inevitable emergence of the phantom tiger. "Fix it!" Richard shouted, his voice slicing through the air with the sharpness of authority, but undercut by the unmistakable edge of panic. He slammed his hand against the side of the vehicle, glaring at the driver who was already scrambling to assess the problem. The vehicle had come to a sudden and complete halt. The front axle dipped into an uneven rut hidden beneath the deceptive layer of grass. The driver muttered something under his breath in his native tongue as he crouched to inspect the damage. "What did you say?" Richard demanded, leaning over him, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I said it stuck," the driver replied tersely, wiping sweat from his brow. "We need to dig it out carefully." Richard threw his arms up, pacing in a tight circle beside the vehicle. "Unbelievable. I pay for an exclusive experience and this is what I get? Incompetence?" The driver ignored him, focusing instead on the precarious tilt of the front tire. Quito, concealed a short distance away behind a dense cluster of reeds, observed the escalating scene with silent intensity, his gaze darting between the agitated foreigner and the increasingly nervous driver. As the driver retrieved a small spade from the back of the vehicle and began to dig around the sunken wheel, Richard crouched beside him, not to assist, but to supervise with growing impatience. "How long is this going to take?" he hissed, glancing nervously into the surrounding foliage. The driver did not answer immediately, his focus fixed on the stubborn earth that clung tightly to the tire. "It depends. If the soil is too compacted, it might be hours before we get out." Richard let out a derisive laugh. "Hours? Absolutely not. We don't have that kind of time." He stood abruptly and took several steps away from the vehicle, pulling out his satellite phone and attempting to get a signal, only to be met with a dead screen. "Of course," he muttered bitterly. The driver glanced up from his work, his eyes narrowing. "We are too far out. There's no signal here." Richard's fingers tightened around the phone as if he could will it to life, then shoved it back into his pocket with a growl of frustration. Quito shifted in his position, now crouching lower as he sensed a subtle but undeniable shift in the energy of the clearing. The driver paused his digging, his brow furrowing as he turned his head sharply toward the dense undergrowth on the opposite side of the clearing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice a notch above a whisper. Richard, still pacing near the vehicle, stopped and looked at him with confusion. "Hear what?" The driver stood slowly, his eyes locked on the thicket, from which a faint but deliberate rustling sound had just emanated. "Something's moving out there," he said, his voice tight with unease. Richard followed his gaze, squinting into the foliage, but seeing nothing. "It's probably just some antelope or a warthog," he said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. The driver did not respond, instead moving slowly around to the back of the vehicle, where a rifle was secured. Seeing this, Richard scoffed. "Oh, please, you're overreacting." But the driver's hands did not falter as he carefully unlatched the weapon, checking its magazine before holding it at the ready. Quito's heart pounded as he watched the driver's deliberate movements, his own instincts screaming that something far more dangerous than a warthog lurked just beyond the veil of green. Then, without warning, the underbrush exploded as a massive form emerged with terrifying grace. The driver raised the rifle instinctively, but his hands trembled as his eyes locked onto the impossible sight before him. From the shadows stepped the phantom tiger, its immense frame dwarfing any creature either man had ever encountered in this land. Its muscles rippled beneath its thick, striped coat, and its amber eyes glowed with a sentient menace as they scanned the clearing. Richard froze entirely, the bravado and arrogance that had defined him until now dissolving instantly into primal terror. The driver swallowed hard, his finger twitching near the trigger, but unable to summon the courage to fire. Quito inhaled sharply, his mind racing through every story he had ever heard about the beast, none of which had prepared him for the reality of its presence. The tiger took a slow, deliberate step forward, its enormous paw pressing into the earth with the weight and certainty of a creature that knew it, ruled this domain unequivocally. Richard took a faltering step backward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound emerging. His eyes remained locked with those of the tiger, whose gaze was steady, unblinking, and impossibly intelligent. The driver hissed under his breath, "Don't move!" But Richard's body betrayed him as he stumbled back another pace, his heel catching on a rock and sending him sprawling to the ground. The tiger's head tilted slightly at the sudden movement, its ears twitching as it adjusted its trajectory, now moving directly toward the fallen man. Quito's muscles tensed as he evaluated the rapidly deteriorating situation, knowing that any sudden movement on his part could draw the beast's attention, but equally aware that doing nothing could mean the foreigner's death. The driver, still gripping the rifle, took a single shaky step to the side, attempting to position himself between Richard and the tiger, but his eyes betrayed the same paralyzing fear that had already overtaken his employer. The tiger advanced with slow, purposeful strides, each step bringing it closer to Richard, who remained frozen on the ground, his hands splayed out behind him as he tried to scoot backward without success. "Shoot it!" Richard finally screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. But the driver didn't move, his body locked in place as the tiger let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the very air between them. Quito inched closer from his concealed position, his mind calculating whether he could intervene without becoming the tiger's next target. He spotted a fallen branch nearby, its jagged end protruding at an angle that might serve as a makeshift weapon, but even he knew that such a gesture would be more symbolic than effective against a predator of this magnitude. The tiger paused for a moment, lifting its head slightly to scent the air, its nostrils flaring as it caught the mixture of sweat, fear, and machine oil that permeated the clearing. The driver exhaled shakily, finally raising the rifle to his shoulder, but before he could steady his aim, the tiger's gaze snapped to him, its body coiling in preparation for a potential strike. "No, no, no," the driver muttered under his breath, lowering the barrel instinctively as he realized that firing might provoke the very attack he hoped to avoid. Richard, now breathing in ragged gasps, began to scramble backward across the dirt, his designer shirt tearing against the rough ground as he tried to put distance between himself and the predator. The tiger's head swiveled back to him, its eyes narrowing as it resumed its advance. With terrifying calm, Quito's grip tightened around the small knife at his belt, his breathing controlled despite the rapid beat of his heart. Every fiber of his being told him that this was the moment when life and death balanced on the edge of a decision yet to be made. He watched, frozen, as the tiger lifted its massive paw, placing it inches from Richard's trembling leg. Richard shut his eyes tightly, waiting for the inevitable impact of claws and teeth. But the strike never came. Instead, the tiger sniffed at him, its whiskers brushing against the fabric of his torn shirt as it evaluated this strange, quivering creature that had trespassed into its territory. The driver remained motionless, his finger poised near the trigger, but unable to press it, paralyzed by the conflicting instincts of survival and fear. Quito leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto the tiger's every subtle movement, searching for any sign that might indicate whether the beast intended to attack or merely intimidate. The tiger let out a soft huff, almost dismissive, then turned its massive head toward the vehicle, its eyes narrowing as it assessed the machine that had invaded its sanctuary. Richard exhaled sharply, his body collapsing further into the dirt as the immediate threat appeared to wane. But Quito knew better. The tiger's apparent disinterest could be fleeting, and its patience had limits. The driver finally found his voice and whispered urgently, "Stay still, don't provoke it." Richard nodded frantically, barely able to breathe as he kept his body pressed flat against the earth. The tiger circled him slowly, its tail flicking lazily from side to side as it maintained its dominance over the clearing. Quito's eyes followed the predator's path, noting the subtle signs of its mood, the relaxed positioning of its ears, the controlled swish of its tail, the deliberate pacing, all indications that it was not yet committed to a full-scale attack, but equally not ready to retreat. The driver shifted his weight slightly, preparing to move toward Richard if the opportunity arose, to pull him back to the vehicle. But Quito saw something that neither man did, a second set of paw prints leading away from the clearing, partially obscured by the undergrowth. His mind reeled with the realization that this tiger might not be alone, and the presence of another could complicate the already perilous situation beyond measure, Quito made a split-second decision, gripping the branch he had spotted earlier and creeping closer to the clearing's edge. He knew that any intervention carried immense risk, not just to himself, but to everyone present. Yet, watching the predator dominate the scene, he also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. Richard remained frozen on the ground, the driver paralyzed a few steps away, and the tiger continued its calculated patrol around the vehicle. Quito steadied his breathing, positioning himself for what could be the most dangerous move of his life. His eyes flicked once more to the second set of tracks, confirming his suspicion before returning to the immediate threat before him. In his mind, there was only one thought: act decisively or witness the inevitable conclusion of this deadly encounter. Without hesitation, he prepared to emerge from the brush, fully aware that his actions in the next few moments would determine whether the phantom tiger claimed another victim or was driven back into the shadows of legend. Quito darted forward from his concealed position, his body moving before his mind could fully process the implications of what he was about to do. The image of the billionaire sprawled helplessly on the ground, his hands trembling as the phantom tiger prowled within arm's reach, left no room for hesitation. He knew instinctively that the driver, whose legs had already carried him in a panicked sprint into the thickets, was not coming back. Quito's eyes scanned the immediate surroundings, his mind compartmentalizing the chaos into actionable steps. There, a dry branch, thick but manageable, partially buried under a mound of brittle leaves. He lunged toward it, yanking it free with a force that splintered one end into a jagged point. Without pausing, he ripped the bottom hem of his already tattered shirt, wrapping the cloth tightly around the branch's tip, twisting and knotting it until it held firm. His heart pounded not from fear, but from urgency. This man, ignorant as he was, didn't deserve to be ripped apart by the beast that now considered him prey. Dropping to his knees, Quito pulled 2 stones from his satchel, positioning them near the makeshift torch and striking them with precise, practiced movements, his eyes never leaving the tiger's slow, deliberate circling. The stones clashed repeatedly, each strike producing a brief but stubborn spark that fizzled out before catching. Quito gritted his teeth, adjusting the cloth slightly, ensuring that the driest fibers were at the outermost edge. He struck again, the rhythm relentless, until finally a fragile ember glowed faintly at the torch's tip. With a controlled breath, he leaned closer, coaxing the ember with short, rapid puffs until it ignited into a modest flame. The fire licked hungrily at the fabric, growing in confidence as Quito stood and rotated the branch slowly, ensuring it would catch fully before wielding it as his sole weapon against the apex predator before him. He didn't waste time marveling at the success. There was too much at stake. The tiger, still preoccupied with the billionaire's cowering form, had not yet registered Quito's movements. Yet Quito knew better than to assume that its instincts hadn't already detected the shift in the air, the presence of something unexpected, something that did not belong to its calculated hunt. Gripping the torch tightly with both hands, Quito took a deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing, his body poised between the billionaire's prone figure and the predator that dominated the clearing. Richard's eyes flicked upward as he caught the faint flicker of light emerging from the edge of the clearing. For a moment, his mind struggled to reconcile the image. A barefoot boy, filthy and lean, stepping forward with a burning torch clenched in his hands, his posture neither frantic nor suicidal, but calculated, deliberate. "What?" Richard croaked, his voice hoarse with disbelief and terror. Quito didn't acknowledge the man's confusion. His focus was entirely on the tiger, whose massive head had finally turned toward this new interloper. The beast's amber eyes narrowed, and its upper lip curled slightly, exposing a row of yellowed, dagger-like teeth. Quito took another step forward, raising the torch higher, waving it gently to expand the circle of firelight between himself and the animal. The tiger let out a low, guttural sound, more inquisitive than aggressive, shifting its weight onto its hind legs as if assessing whether this small, defiant figure posed any real threat. Quito knew that the odds of intimidating such a creature were slim at best, but he also knew that most predators, no matter how dominant, had an innate aversion to fire. The tiger prowled in a slow arc, its tail swishing lazily as it considered its options. Quito matched its movement, rotating steadily to maintain the fragile barrier created by the wavering flame. Richard, still frozen on the ground, flinched with each calculated step the boy took, torn between his instinct to crawl away and his realization that any movement might draw the tiger's wrath. "What are you doing?" Richard hissed finally, his voice barely above a whisper, not daring to believe that this child, of all people, could be his salvation. Quito spared him only the briefest of glances, his jaw set, his eyes flashing with determination as he gestured with a sharp flick of his head for the man to remain still. The tiger paused, inhaling deeply as it caught the scent of burning cloth mixed with human sweat and adrenaline. It exhaled in a long, dismissive huff, the sound sending a shiver through Richard's spine. Quito seized the moment of hesitation, taking 2 more assertive steps forward, thrusting the torch out forcefully to expand the reach of the flame. The tiger's ears flattened slightly, its muscles coiling as it seemed to weigh the threat more seriously. Quito's grip on the torch tightened, his knuckles whitening as he prepared for the possibility that the fire would fail to deter the beast. He pivoted carefully, ensuring that his body remained between Richard and the predator, angling the torch to maximize its illumination across the tiger's line of sight. The beast's gaze flicked between the flame and the cowering man behind it, its instincts pulling it in conflicting directions. Curiosity, hunger, caution. Quito's mind raced through every story he had heard from the elders of his village, recalling how fire had driven off hyenas, leopards, even elephants, but also remembering the rare tales where it had failed, where the animal had chosen to challenge the flame rather than retreat from it. He swallowed hard, refusing to let his own fear betray him in this pivotal moment. The tiger lowered its head slightly, its eyes narrowing further, before taking a slow step back, its massive paws pressing deliberate indentations into the earth. Richard exhaled sharply, a sound bordering on a sob as he realized the tiger was not advancing, but withdrawing, however, reluctantly. Quito didn't allow himself the luxury of relief. He maintained his stance, torch raised, tracking every movement as the predator inched backward toward the line of thick undergrowth from which it had first emerged. The beast stopped momentarily at the clearings, edge swiveling its head to deliver one final piercing stare at Quito, as if memorizing the face of the human who had dared defy it. Then, with a calculated pivot, the phantom tiger disappeared into the foliage, its departure as silent as its arrival had been thunderous. Quito remained frozen in place, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths as he waited, listening intently for any indication that the tiger might return. Only when he was certain that the beast had retreated beyond the immediate perimeter did he lower the torch slightly, turning his gaze at last toward the man. Still lying motionless behind him, Richard struggled to sit up, his hands trembling as he pushed against the ground for leverage. His eyes remained locked on Quito, a mixture of disbelief, awe, and residual terror playing across his features. You saved me," he stammered, his voice raw and unsteady. Quito offered no immediate response, his expression guarded, his focus still partially on the surrounding brush. He approached the man cautiously, extending one hand to help him up while keeping the other firmly gripped around the torch, its flame still flickering defiantly against the encroaching dusk. Richard hesitated before grasping the boy's hand, allowing Quito to pull him upright with surprising strength for someone so slight in stature. The billionaire staggered to his feet, glancing around the clearing as if expecting the tiger to re-emerge at any moment. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. Quito finally met his gaze directly, his eyes hard and unwavering as he replied in a steady voice, "Someone who knows this land better than you." Without another word, he turned, leading the man away from the spot where his life had almost ended. As they moved cautiously back toward the vehicle, Richard glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, his nerves still frayed and his mind struggling to process the surreal sequence of events. Quito walked ahead, his posture calm but alert, the torch held aloft to maintain a protective perimeter of light. When they reached the vehicle, Richard hesitated, staring at the empty driver's seat and realizing for the first time that the man he had relied upon had abandoned him completely. "Where's my driver?" he asked, though the answer was painfully obvious. Quito didn't respond, instead climbing into the driver's seat and examining the controls with practiced ease. "You can drive this?" Richard asked incredulously, watching as Quito methodically checked the gears and ignition. Quito glanced at him briefly, nodding. "Better than he did," he said flatly, before turning the key. The engine sputtered, then roared. "To life!" Richard stood silently for a moment before climbing into the passenger seat, still clutching the remnants of his shredded shirt, as if they could shield him from the memory of what had just transpired. Quito shifted the vehicle into gear, guiding it carefully out of the rut where it had been stranded. As the wheels gained traction and they began moving steadily away from the clearing, Richard finally found his voice again. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his tone a mixture of gratitude and genuine curiosity. Quito kept his eyes on the path ahead, navigating the treacherous terrain with precision. "Because no one else was going to," he answered simply, his words devoid of sentimentality, but heavy with an unspoken understanding of the Savanna's brutal realities. Richard leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as he stared out at the landscape that had nearly claimed his life. The silence between them was not one of comfort, but of mutual acknowledgement, each recognizing that their encounter had irrevocably altered the course of both their lives. Quito tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind already shifting to the next challenge, finding a safe place before nightfall, when the Savanna's true predators would once again claim dominion over the land. Quito lunged forward, positioning himself firmly between Richard and the predator, raising the torch high above his head with both hands and thrusting it forward in sharp, deliberate motions. "Get back!" he shouted with force, his voice cutting through the tension. The tiger stopped mid-step, its massive body tensing as the flames crackled in front of it. Quito's eyes locked onto the beast's piercing amber gaze, refusing to show the fear that threatened to claw its way up from his gut. The tiger shifted its weight from one paw to the other, then took a step back, muscles rippling beneath its striped coat. Quito seized the moment to advance, waving the torch wider in an arc to increase the illusion of size and danger. "Stay down!" he commanded without looking at Richard, whose body was still frozen in a crouched position behind him. The billionaire whimpered softly, but nodded, unable to force his limbs to move. Quito pivoted slightly, adjusting his stance to keep the tiger in front of him, but already he could feel the warmth of the flame diminishing, the fuel from his tattered cloth burning away too quickly for his liking. The tiger's ears flicked as it gauged the situation, retreating another step but then stopping, its eyes narrowing with a calculating focus. It was not deterred, it was deciding. Quito felt the heat near his fingers cooling, the fabric on the torch blackening as the fire shrank to a stubborn flicker. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, tightening his grip. With a sudden guttural snarl, the tiger took a lateral step, beginning to circle them slowly, its padded paws making no sound on the dry earth. Quito followed its movement with the torch, rotating as it did, refusing to allow the predator an angle from which to strike unseen. "It's trying to find an opening," Quito hissed, his voice low but firm. Richard, barely able to lift his head, asked weakly, What do we do?" Quito's eyes never left the tiger as he answered coldly, "We don't run. Running means death." Richard let out a choked sob but obeyed, clutching his knees tighter to his chest. Quito knew that the next few moments would decide everything and that hesitation was not an option. The flames sputtered, shrinking further until only a small core of embers remained, clinging stubbornly to the tip of the branch. Quito cursed silently, his mind racing for alternatives. The tiger's circling grew tighter, its tail flicking with increased agitation, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air, heavily saturated with the sense of fear, sweat, and smoke. Not much time, Quito thought grimly, weighing his options. He couldn't drop the torch. Even its meager glow provided a psychological barrier against the predator, but without something to reignite or sustain it, the advantage would vanish entirely. Quito glanced quickly over his shoulder at Richard, then scanned the ground for anything usable. Dry grass, bark, anything that could fuel another burst of flame. His eyes landed on a small cluster of desiccated leaves and twigs near Richard's feet. "Grab those!" he barked. Richard looked up in confusion. "What?" Quito snapped louder. "The leaves! Pass them here!" Richard fumbled, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he gathered the brittle debris, and Quito snatched it, pressing it carefully to the dying flame and blowing gently to coax it back to life. The embers caught weakly at first, then flared as the dry material ignited in a sudden burst of light and heat. Quito didn't waste a second. He tilted the torch upward, feeding the flame as it licked hungrily along the new fuel. The light expanded, forcing the tiger to halt its circling and take a cautious step back, its eyes narrowing as it reassessed the increased threat. "That's it," Quito muttered under his breath, his confidence rebuilding alongside the flame. Richard let out a shuddering breath, the sudden surge of light momentarily giving him hope where there had been none. The tiger crouched slightly, coiling as if to spring, but Quito reacted instantly, lunging forward with the torch in a wide, aggressive sweep that forced the beast to retreat another step. "Move back!" Quito instructed Richard tersely, never breaking his focus from the tiger. Richard obeyed, inching backward along the ground, his movements clumsy but obedient, his mind too overwhelmed by terror to resist. Quito maintained his stance, brandishing the torch like a sword, each movement calculated to keep the animal at bay. The tiger let out a guttural growl, not of fear but of frustration, as it was denied the easy meal it had anticipated. It circled again, but at a greater distance now, its caution visibly growing in the face of Quito's defiance and the renewed fire. Good, Quito thought, sensing the shift in the predator's behavior, but he knew better than to let his guard down. One misstep, one lapse in vigilance, and the tiger could cover the ground between them in a single, deadly leap. Richard, still crawling backward, managed to reach a nearby tree and pressed his back against it, as if the solid bark could shield him from the nightmare unfolding before his eyes. "Is it leaving?" he asked in a trembling voice. Quito shook his head sharply. "Not yet. It's deciding if we're worth the risk." The tiger paused once more, muscles tense, eyes flicking between the boy with the fire and the man cowering against the tree. Quito adjusted his grip on the torch, prepared for either outcome. Without warning, the tiger lunged forward a few paces, snapping its jaws in a feint meant to test their reactions. Quito stood his ground, thrusting the torch forward with a shout that startled both Richard and the predator itself. The tiger skidded to a halt, its paws kicking up a small cloud of dust as it recoiled from the unexpected resistance. "That's right," Quito growled, stepping toward the beast with deliberate aggression. The tiger took several more steps back, its ears flattening as it reassessed this small human who dared to challenge it with nothing more than fire and fury. Quito's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through every vein, but he forced his breathing to remain steady, his movements controlled. "We're leaving," Quito said over his shoulder to Richard, who looked up at him with disbelief. "Now?" Quito nodded firmly, never removing his eyes from the tiger. "Get to the vehicle." Slowly. Richard swallowed hard and began to edge along the tree line, moving in the direction of the path they had come from, while Quito maintained his position between him and the predator. Quito advanced carefully, each step calculated to push the tiger further from their escape route without provoking it into a defensive attack. The tiger mirrored his movements, pacing sideways with tense deliberation, unwilling to surrender its territory, but increasingly wary of the determined human wielding the unpredictable flame. Richard reached the vehicle first, collapsing into the passenger seat with a gasp of relief. But Quito held his ground a moment longer, ensuring the tiger had fully disengaged. When the beast finally turned with a final disdainful huff and disappeared into the thicket, Quito exhaled and lowered the torch slightly, though he did not extinguish it. He backed toward the vehicle, never turning his back on the place where the tiger had vanished until he was safely inside. Only then did he allow the torch to drop into the dirt outside, stamping out the last embers with a firm foot. You actually did it," Richard whispered, staring at him in disbelief. Quito gave a single terse nod before turning the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. Without another word, he shifted into gear and guided them away from the clearing, leaving behind only the faintest traces of ash and footprints in the dust. As the vehicle bounced over the uneven terrain, Richard sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. His hands shook as he clutched the dashboard, his mind replaying the image of the boy standing fearlessly between him and death, wielding nothing but a makeshift torch and sheer determination. Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with residual panic. Quito kept his eyes on the path ahead, navigating with practiced precision through the maze of brush and rock. "Quito," he answered simply. Richard swallowed hard, nodding slowly as if committing the name to memory. "You saved my life." Quito offered no response, his focus entirely on ensuring they put as much distance as possible between themselves and the predator that had nearly ended them both. The vehicle climbed a small rise, and as they crested the hill, Quito paused, glancing back briefly at the clearing below, now empty and deceptively peaceful. Without another word, he pressed the accelerator and continued driving, his mind already shifting to the next challenge that lay ahead. "Get up, now!" Quito shouted, his voice cutting through Richard's dazed stupor as he yanked the billionaire's arm with all the force his wiry frame could muster. Richard grimaced in pain, his legs barely cooperating, but Quito wasn't waiting for permission. With a powerful tug, he pulled Richard to his feet, slinging the man's arm over his shoulder as he half-dragged, half-guided him away from the vehicle. "We can't stay here," Quito barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Richard staggered forward, his mind still reeling from the sheer disbelief of what had just happened with the tiger. Where are we going?" he panted. But Quito ignored the question, focusing solely on the narrow break in the rocks ahead, the only place he knew where the tiger's massive body couldn't easily follow. The boy's legs pumped furiously against the uneven ground, the torch now discarded, their only priority to create as much distance as possible from the predator that had nearly claimed their lives. Behind them, the unmistakable sound of heavy paws crushing against dry earth spurred Quito to move even faster, his grip tightening on Richard's wrist as he practically dragged him toward the jagged opening ahead. "This way," Quito shouted, steering them toward the narrow gap between two enormous rock faces that jutted up like the teeth of some ancient beast. Richard's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled after the boy, his heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the paralyzing awareness that the tiger was still behind them, relentless in its pursuit. Quito's mind was laser-focused. He knew this terrain intimately, every crag, every loose stone that could trip them, every crevice that could offer temporary shelter. As they approached the entrance to the treacherous passage, known as the Garganta do Diabo, Quito yelled over his shoulder, "Stay close and don't stop, no matter what." Richard barely had the strength to nod, his body propelled only by the primal instinct to survive. Suddenly, a guttural roar echoed behind them, closer than before, and Quito risked a quick glance over his shoulder, his stomach tightening at the sight of the tiger leaping effortlessly over a fallen log, closing the gap between them with terrifying speed. With no time to spare, Quito pushed Richard ahead through the narrow passage, shoving him between the rock walls that were barely wide, enough to accommodate a grown man's shoulders. "Go!" Quito barked, and Richard stumbled forward, squeezing through the tight confines as jagged stones scraped against his arms. Quito followed close behind, his eyes darting back to catch a glimpse of the tiger lunging toward them, only to be forced to halt abruptly at the entrance of the gorge, its massive body unable to fit through the narrow opening. The beast let out an enraged roar, slashing its claws futilely against the rock, sending shards of stone splintering in all directions. Richard collapsed to his knees just a few meters inside the passage, gasping for air, but Quito was on him instantly, grabbing his arm. "Not here! Keep moving!" he ordered, pulling him to his feet once again. Richard grimaced, but then his ankle gave out beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground with a strangled cry of pain. "My ankle!" Richard groaned. Richard, clutching at the rapidly swelling joint, Quito knelt beside him, his mind racing as he assessed the injury. "You twisted it," he said quickly, before glancing back toward the mouth of the gorge, where the tiger paced furiously, its predatory instincts frustrated by the rock's natural barrier. Quito grabbed Richard's arm again and heaved. "You can't stop. It can still find a way around." Richard looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. "I can't walk," he protested. Quito shook his head firmly. "Then crawl, but you're not staying here." Without waiting for another complaint, Quito slipped under one of Richard's arms and hoisted him up, forcing him to hop on his good leg. "Come on, move," Quito urged, guiding him deeper into the winding passage. The rocks pressed in tighter with every step, and Quito had to twist his body sideways to navigate through certain sections, dragging the injured man along with him, while the predator's distant growls echoed through the stone corridor. As they pressed further into the gorge, Quito's mind kept calculating their options, rapidly filtering through every memory of this treacherous path. He knew that the passage opened up slightly, about 50 meters ahead, near a ledge that overlooked a sheer drop into a rocky ravine. If they could reach that ledge, they could take a brief rest and assess their situation. But between them and that temporary haven lay a particularly dangerous stretch where loose rocks often gave way beneath careless feet, a risk made even more perilous by Richard's injury. "Careful here," Quito warned, as they approached the narrowest segment of the gorge. Richard hissed in pain as each step sent sharp jolts up his leg, but he grit his teeth and leaned heavily on the boy, guiding him. Quito placed each foot with deliberate precision, making sure his own weight was stable before shifting Richard's. But just as they were about to clear the tightest part of the passage, a small rock slipped beneath Quito's foot, sending both of them careening sideways against the jagged wall. Quito absorbed most of the impact, his shoulder slamming painfully into the unforgiving stone. But he didn't let go of Richard's arm. "You okay?" he gasped, pushing them both upright. Richard nodded shakily, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes filled with determination now rather than terror. Yeah, keep going," he panted. "Quito." He allowed himself a brief nod of approval before pulling Richard along once more. Behind them, the tiger's growls grew more distant, but Quito knew better than to assume they were safe. The predator might not be able to follow them directly through the gorge, but it could easily circle around the rock in formation and cut them off further ahead. "We don't have much time," Quito muttered, half to himself, half to Richard. What happens if it finds another way?" Richard asked between ragged breaths. Quito glanced at him grimly. "Then we'll have to fight again, but let's not give it that chance." With renewed urgency, he pulled Richard onward through the winding labyrinth of stone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of painstaking progress, Quito spotted the ledge up ahead. "Almost there," he called, pointing toward the narrow outcropping that extended just beyond the gorge's exit. Richard nodded weakly, focusing every ounce of his remaining strength on following Quito's lead. As they stumbled onto the ledge, Quito guided Richard to sit down carefully, keeping his injured ankle elevated as best as possible. Quito crouched beside him, both of them taking a moment to catch their breath. From their vantage point, they could see the jagged terrain sprawling out below, a dizzying drop that offered no safe path downward. Quito scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement that might indicate the tiger's position, but the landscape remained ominously still. "We're not out of danger yet," Quito warned, turning back to Richard, "but at least we've bought ourselves a little time." Richard leaned back against the rock, closing his eyes briefly before opening them again to look at the boy who had saved his life not once, but twice now. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. Quito didn't respond immediately, his focus still on their surroundings, his mind already working through the next steps. "We can't stay here long," he finally said, standing up and peering cautiously back down the gorge. "That thing, it's smart. If it figures out a way, around, we'll need to move fast." Richard nodded, wincing as he shifted his injured leg. "What do we do now?" he asked. Quito turned back to him, his expression resolute. "Now we find another path out of here before the tiger does." He extended his hand to help Richard up again, and despite the billionaire's obvious pain, he grasped it firmly, pulling himself to his feet with Quito's support. Together, they prepared to continue their perilous journey, knowing that every step forward brought them closer to safety, or back into the jaws of the predator that still hunted them through the unforgiving wilderness. "Come on, keep moving," Quito ordered, as he wrapped his arm around Richard's waist and began dragging him toward the narrow slit in the rock wall that barely revealed the hidden entrance. Richard groaned, his injured ankle sending jolts of pain through his leg with every step. But Quito didn't give him time to complain. He tightened his grip and pulled harder, guiding them into the barely perceptible gap. Richard stumbled inside, his shoulder scraping against the jagged stone as he forced his body through, while Quito pushed him from behind with urgent strength. Once they were both inside, Quito immediately guided Richard further down the uneven ground, deeper into the cavern's dark recesses. Where are we?" Richard stammered, peering into the darkness that swallowed up the space around them. "A place no one comes to," Quito answered tersely, pushing him to sit against a cold rock. "Ledge." Quito moved a few paces forward, crouching low and surveying the interior. His eyes adjusted quickly, and he immediately noticed the familiar yet unsettling shapes littered across the ground. Bones, some broken cleanly, others gnawed, and worse still, a partially intact human skull resting precariously against a wall. Richard's breath caught as his gaze followed Quito's and landed on the macabre display scattered through the cavern. "Oh my God," he whispered, instinctively pulling his legs in closer to his body, as though shrinking himself could provide any meaningful protection against the ghosts of whatever had died there. Are those human?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and mounting horror. Quito didn't answer immediately. He rose to his feet, moving cautiously around the perimeter of the space, stepping carefully between the skeletal remains as he evaluated the cave's structural integrity. He wasn't concerned about the bones. He had seen them before and knew well enough that the cave hadn't been used as an active den in some time. But now, with the phantom tiger nearby, all bets were off. He finally turned to Richard and, with a finger pressed firmly to his lips, signaled for absolute silence. Richard swallowed hard and nodded, his body trembling as he tightened his arms around his knees. Quito moved quietly back to the entrance, positioning himself just inside the crack where he could monitor the outside while keeping hidden. Richard couldn't take his eyes off the skull, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. The gruesome evidence of death surrounded him, suffocating any rational thoughts of escape or survival. He forced himself to look away, focusing instead on Quito's crouched silhouette near the entrance. "Is it safe?" he finally whispered, unable to suppress the question any longer. Quito didn't respond at first. His entire body was tense, his muscles coiled like springs as he listened intently. After a long moment, he turned slightly toward Richard and gave a subtle shake of his head. "No, it wasn't safe." Richard's heart sank, and he instinctively pressed himself even further against the cold, damp rock behind him, feeling utterly useless. Quito's eyes remained fixed on the outside, and Richard followed his line of sight just in time to see a large, unmistakable shadow pass across the narrow opening. Richard clamped his hands over his mouth to stifle the terrified sound that rose in his throat, while Quito remained absolutely still, his eyes narrowing, calculating their next move with deadly precision. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound vibrated through the entrance as the phantom tiger's head appeared in the gap, its massive snout pushing between the stones as it sniffed aggressively, its whiskers twitching with agitation. Richard froze, his eyes widening in horror as the beast's presence filled the confined space with raw, predatory menace. Quito didn't move, didn't even blink, knowing that any sudden shift would draw the tiger's attention directly to them. The tiger's claws raked across the stone, sending a cascade of pebbles and dust to the floor as it tested the integrity of the barrier separating it from its prey. Richard involuntarily flinched at the noise, but Quito shot him a glare so intense that it rooted him to the spot. The tiger growled again, louder this time, its frustration mounting as it realized the stones wouldn't easily give way. It began pawing more aggressively, sending sharp fragments flying through the air as it tried to widen the entrance by brute force. Quito silently cursed their luck. He hadn't expected the animal to be this determined. Quito leaned his weight slightly forward, calculating whether they had any chance of slipping out through another exit. But he knew the cave had no other opening. It was a dead end, an ancient trap created by nature itself, and now they were the ones caught inside. He turned back toward Richard and mouthed, "Stay silent." Richard nodded, his body locked in place, but every muscle screamed for him to run, to hide, to do anything other than sit passively as death clawed its way toward them. The tiger's growls deepened as it pressed its bulk harder against the rocks, and a sickening crack echoed through the cavern as one of the smaller stones gave way under the pressure. Richard bit down hard on his knuckle to keep from crying out, tears forming involuntarily in the corners of his eyes as he realized just how thin the line between survival and death had become. Quito repositioned himself between Richard and the entrance, his body ready to act. Though he had no clear plan of how to confront a predator capable of tearing through solid rock, the tiger continued its relentless assault on the cave's entrance, ramming its massive shoulder into the rocks now, causing the entire structure to tremble with each impact. Dust cascaded from the ceiling as pebbles tumbled down around them. Quito raised his hand slightly, signaling Richard not to move, before adjusting his stance and picking up a loose rock, weighing it carefully in his palm. It was a pathetic weapon against a creature of such size and strength, but it was all he had. Quito's eyes darted around the cave, looking for anything else that could be used as a deterrent, but the cavern was barren save for the decayed remnants of long-dead creatures. Another brutal shove from the tiger sent more debris skittering across the ground, and Quito could now see the tip of one of the animal's claws forcing its way through the widening gap. Richard whimpered involuntarily, drawing Quito's sharp glare again, but the man couldn't help himself. He was breaking down, his mind fraying at the edges under the weight of the terror pressing against the stone walls. With each successive blow, the entrance gave way a little more, and Quito knew it was only a matter of time before the tiger forced itself through entirely. He turned back to Richard, crouching close and gripping the man's shoulder tightly to ensure his full attention. "When I tell you to move, you run to the back of the cave and stay there. Don't come out unless I say so," Quito instructed in a hushed but authoritative tone. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. "But what about you?" he stammered. Quito didn't answer directly. Instead, he squeezed Richard's shoulder once, firmly, then released him and stood up, placing himself squarely between the man and the failing entrance. He tightened his grip on the rock in his hand, ready to use it as a last resort. The tiger roared again, louder and more furious than before, sensing that its efforts were beginning to pay off. Quito inhaled deeply, steeling himself for what could very well be his final stand, his mind racing with every survival tactic he had ever learned in these unforgiving lands. The wall of stone at the entrance shuddered under yet another powerful slam from the tiger's massive body, sending a cloud of dust and smaller rocks collapsing into the cave. Quito stood firm, his body braced, his eyes locked onto the encroaching claw that scraped furiously against the fractured rocks. Richard, barely able to breathe, watched as the boy positioned himself fearlessly in front of the deadly force that was moments away from breaking through. "You can't fight it," Richard whispered hoarsely, but Quito ignored him completely, his entire focus on anticipating the next move of the predator outside. The tiger let out another guttural snarl, this time accompanied by a more determined shove, causing a sizable section of the rock wall to dislodge and crash to the cave floor with a thunderous thud. Through the widening hole, Quito could now see the beast's furious eyes staring directly at him. He gripped the rock tighter, raising it slightly, knowing that whatever happened next would demand every ounce of courage he possessed. Without hesitation, Quito darted toward the corner of the cave where he had spotted the battered shape of an old drum, its once taut skin now weathered but still intact enough to produce sound. He grabbed it with both hands, dragging it quickly into position just a few feet from the fractured entrance where the tiger's massive paw was already pushing through. Richard stared in confusion and horror, his mind unable to comprehend why the boy was wasting precious seconds on an old, useless instrument when they were about to be torn apart. "What are you doing?" Richard hissed, but Quito didn't even glance in his direction. Instead, he knelt behind the drum, picked up a sturdy femur from the scattered bones nearby, and without any further hesitation, slammed it hard against the drum's surface. The deep, resonant boom exploded through the confined space, reverberating violently off the walls of the cave and out through the jagged entrance, magnifying the sound far beyond what its size would normally allow. The tiger reacted instantly, freezing as the first percussion blast hit its sensitive ears, the unexpected noise cutting through its predatory focus like a knife. Quito struck the drum again, even harder this time, sending another seismic pulse through the cavern. Quito kept up the relentless barrage, hammering the drum with all his strength in a furious rhythmic assault designed not for musicality but for survival. Each thundering strike sent shockwaves through the rock, creating an unnatural cacophony that disrupted the tiger's instincts and confused its well-honed senses. The beast recoiled slightly, stepping back from the fractured entrance, its claws withdrawing momentarily from the crevice it had been widening. Richard stared at Quito in disbelief, the sound waves practically vibrating through his chest as he watched the boy attack the instrument with singular determination. "It's working," Richard muttered under his breath, though he barely believed it himself. Quito didn't pause to acknowledge the observation. He simply kept beating the drum, varying the rhythm unpredictably to further destabilize the tiger's perception. The animal snarled loudly, shaking its massive head in frustration as it attempted to regain composure, but the relentless noise assaulted it from every direction, amplified by the cave's natural acoustics. Quito saw the hesitation in the beast's eyes, a flicker of doubt that betrayed its once unwavering dominance. Seizing the opportunity, Quito intensified the force and speed of his strikes, his arms burning from the exertion, but his focus unwavering. The tiger let out an enraged roar, its most deafening yet, but this time it wasn't a sound of imminent attack. It was a cry of confusion and distress. The powerful feline backed away further from the entrance, shaking its head violently, as if trying to dispel the overwhelming sound that now enveloped it. Richard could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The mighty predator that had moments ago been seconds from tearing them apart was now retreating, driven back by nothing more than sound and human will. Quito delivered one final, emphatic strike, the reverberation echoing long after his arm fell still. Then he paused, his chest heaving from the sustained effort. Through the dust-choked air of the cave, they both watched as the tiger, with one last frustrated growl, turned abruptly and bounded away from the entrance, disappearing from sight as its heavy body crashed through the dense underbrush beyond the rocks. For several agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. Quito remained crouched behind the drum, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the now empty entrance, while Richard sat frozen against the rock wall, his breathing ragged and uncontrolled. Is it gone?" Richard finally whispered, his voice hoarse and fragile. Quito didn't respond immediately. He shifted slowly from behind the drum, rising to his feet while keeping his eyes locked on the gap, watching for any signs that the tiger might have doubled back, perhaps approaching from another angle. Only after a full minute passed with no movement did Quito allow himself to exhale, the tension releasing incrementally from his taut muscles. He turned toward Richard, nodding once in confirmation, but keeping his posture ready in case the beast's retreat was a feint. Richard slumped further against the wall, his hands gripping at his knees as he tried to process the sheer improbability of what had just happened. His chest heaved with each breath, his mind vacillating between disbelief, relief, and the residual terror that still clung to every nerve. Quito approached Richard cautiously, kneeling beside him and placing a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. "We're safe, for now," Quito said quietly but firmly, his voice carrying the weight of experience despite his young age. Richard looked at him with wide, incredulous eyes. "How did you know? How did you even think to do that?" he asked, gesturing weakly toward the drum, now lying silent and harmless. In the center of the cavern, Quito shrugged, as though the answer was too obvious to require elaboration. "Animals hate what they don't understand. Sound can be more frightening than sight, especially when they can't locate its source," he explained succinctly, his tone devoid of boastfulness, merely stating fact. Richard shook his head slowly, as though trying to absorb the sheer simplicity of the logic in contrast to the enormity of its impact. "You saved us," Again, he added, his voice breaking slightly. Quito's lips pressed into a thin line. He neither acknowledged nor dismissed the comment, instead shifting his gaze back toward the cave's entrance, remaining vigilant. For several more minutes, the two remained in that position, Quito kneeling with his eyes trained on the outside, while Richard sat slumped against the rock, his mind replaying every harrowing moment that had led them to this point. Finally, Quito stood up fully and extended a hand to Richard. "We need to go," he stated, his voice brooking no argument. Richard hesitated, his body aching and his ankle still throbbing painfully, but he recognized the urgency in Quito's tone and grasped the offered hand. With Quito's help, he staggered to his feet, wincing but managing to steady himself. "Where?" Richard asked, his voice weary but compliant. Quito didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped cautiously toward the entrance, peering out to survey the immediate surroundings for any trace of the tiger's return. Satisfied that the area was clear, he turned back and gestured for Richard to follow. "Away from here, this place, it's not safe." Richard nodded, swallowing hard, and limped after Quito as they began their careful ascent out of the cave, leaving behind the macabre remnants of the cavern's forgotten history. As they emerged cautiously from the mouth of the cave, the thick brush that had once concealed the tiger's approach now appeared empty, though both of them knew that appearances could be deceiving in such an unforgiving landscape. Quito kept a firm grip on Richard's arm as he guided him. Through the narrow passage, his senses heightened to their absolute limits. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated to detect the slightest movement or irregularity in their environment. Richard, though exhausted and in pain, followed obediently, placing his trust entirely in the boy who had saved him twice already through sheer instinct and resilience. As they cleared the immediate area surrounding the cave, Quito finally allowed them a brief pause, positioning Richard against a relatively secure outcropping of rock, while he conducted a broader visual sweep of the surrounding terrain. "I think it's gone," Quito said finally, though he kept his tone cautious. Richard exhaled shakily, leaning his head back against the rock and closing his eyes for a moment, allowing the realization to sink in that, for now, they had survived the phantom tiger's relentless pursuit. But even as the immediate danger receded, both of them understood that their ordeal was far from over. Richard opened his eyes and looked at Quito, studying the boy with a newfound mixture of awe and gratitude. "I don't even know your full name," he said suddenly, as though the absurdity of that fact had only just occurred to him after everything they'd been through together. Quito turned his head slowly to face him, offering the faintest of smiles. "Quito. Just Quito," he replied simply, as though that was all the explanation necessary. Richard nodded, accepting the response without pressing further. For a moment, the two shared a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken bond forged not by choice, but by the raw necessity of survival in one of the most dangerous places either of them had ever known. Then Quito straightened up, extended his hand to Richard once more and said, "Let's keep moving." Richard took the hand without hesitation this time, hoisting himself up as they prepared to continue their journey, away from the cave, away from the echoes of death that still lingered in its dark corners, and toward whatever new challenges awaited them ahead. "Wait," Richard said, his voice strained as he leaned heavily on Quito's shoulder, struggling to steady himself while they climbed out of the last tight curve of the gorge. Quito paused only long enough to adjust his grip beneath Richard's arm, then kept moving forward, pulling the man along the uneven terrain without slowing his pace. "We can't stop here," Quito stated firmly, his eyes darting around as he searched for any signs of renewed danger. Richard groaned, placing most of his weight on Quito, but obeyed without argument. After several more painstaking steps, Quito led them both to a flat section of ground just above the gorge, finally easing Richard down to sit on a rock. Richard exhaled heavily, rubbing his swollen ankle as he glanced up at Quito with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Who taught you to do all this? Richard asked, waving vaguely at the boy's confident movements and decisive actions. Quito didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched nearby, pulling a canteen from a pouch hidden beneath his shirt and handing it to Richard. "Drink," he instructed. Richard accepted it, taking a long sip before wiping his mouth and repeating more softly, "How did you learn to survive like this?" Quito sat back on his heels, his expression unreadable as he considered whether to answer. For the first time since they had met, the tension of immediate survival had eased just enough to allow for something else: conversation, understanding, maybe even trust. "I didn't have a choice," Quito said quietly, his voice flat but steady. Richard tilted his head, watching the boy intently. "What do you mean?" Quito inhaled deeply before answering. "My parents, they were killed. Poachers." He said the word without emotion, as if he had long since burned through whatever grief had once been attached to it. Richard blinked in surprise, sitting up straighter despite the pain in his ankle. I'm sorry," he said automatically, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Quito shrugged, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced vigilance. "It was a long time ago. I was small. After that, I stayed. I figured out how to live here. The animals, the land, they don't care who you are. They just survive. So I did too." Richard swallowed hard, struggling to process the stark simplicity of Quito's existence compared to his own life, a life filled with conveniences, protections, and excess. Richard shifted uncomfortably on the rock, the realization settling in like an unwelcome weight. "How old are you?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine need for information. Quito's lips twitched slightly, almost amused by the question. 12, he answered, standing up and moving a few steps away to check the surrounding area. Richard shook his head slowly, absorbing the information with disbelief. 12, he echoed softly, then laughed bitterly. "At 12, I was whining about my boarding school's cafeteria food." Quito glanced back at him briefly, but didn't comment. Richard continued, more to himself now, "I had everything, and I still thought I didn't have enough." He let out another humorless laugh before looking up at Quito with renewed curiosity. "And you've been out here alone all this time?" Quito nodded without elaborating, as if the fact required no explanation. Richard rubbed his face, trying to reconcile the image of this boy, small, barefoot, resourceful beyond comprehension, with the children he knew back home who cried when their internet went out for 10 minutes. Quito walked to a nearby bush, plucking a handful of small, dark berries and inspecting them carefully before pocketing them in his pouch. Richard watched him with fascination, realizing that every action Quito took was purposeful, calculated for survival, nothing wasted or done without reason. "You're like a part of this place," Richard said finally, gesturing around them at the expanse of Savanna. Quito turned to look at him, shrugging again. "It's just home," he replied simply, then added, "Not like I had anywhere else to go." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied the boy in front of him, feeling something unfamiliar growing in his chest, a gnawing awareness that for the first time in his life, he was face to face with someone whose strength and resilience dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished, despite all his wealth and status. "But you're just a kid," Richard said softly, almost in disbelief. Quito shot him a look, his eyes sharp and direct. "Not anymore," he said, with a finality that left no room for argument. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of Quito's words hanging heavily between them. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly before asking, "Did you ever think about leaving? About going to a city or finding people?" Quito sat back down on the ground across from Richard, pulling his knees up to his chest as he considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but cities don't care about people like me. They chew you up and spit you out. Out here, at least I know the rules. The animals, the land, they don't lie. People do." Richard absorbed that in silence, unable to deny the truth of Quito's statement. He thought of all the boardrooms he'd sat in, all the false smiles and calculated handshakes, all the times trust had been nothing more than a bargaining chip. Quito was right. Out here, life and death were clear, immediate and brutally honest. Richard looked at the boy again, not with pity, but with a deep, profound respect he hadn't anticipated feeling when he first arrived on this ill-conceived adventure. Quito stood up abruptly, brushing dirt off his pants. "We should keep moving," he said, glancing down at Richard's injured ankle. "You can lean on me." Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've already carried me through half of this nightmare. I'm not sure how much more I can ask of you." Quito offered him a faint smirk, extending his hand anyway. "If we stay here, that tiger might come back, or something worse." Richard sobered instantly at the reminder, reaching up to take Quito's hand. The boy pulled him to his feet with surprising strength, steadying him as he adjusted his weight onto his good leg. They began walking again, slowly but with determination, Quito leading the way through the unfamiliar terrain with the confidence of someone who had never known any other path. Richard limped beside him, each painful step a reminder not just of the physical ordeal, but of the transformation taking place. Inside him, an awakening to a world far beyond the confines of his wealth and privilege. As they continued moving away from the gorge, Richard glanced sideways at Quito and said, "You know, when I came here, I thought I was going to conquer nature, get some great photos, brag about it to my friends. Maybe even make a documentary." Quito didn't respond, keeping his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Richard chuckled bitterly at his own admission. "But now, I realize I didn't conquer anything. If anything, I barely survived." Quito finally turned his head, offering Richard a rare, almost approving nod. "You learned something," he said simply, as though that in itself was a victory worth acknowledging. Richard smiled faintly, adjusting his arm around Quito's shoulder for better support. "Yeah, I guess I did." The two of them pressed on, the distance between them shrinking not just in proximity but in understanding. Richard knew he still had a long way to go, physically and otherwise, but with Quito beside him, guiding him through the unforgiving Savanna, for the first time in his life, he wasn't leading the way. And for the first time, he was glad of it. "There!" Richard shouted, pointing ahead with his good arm, his voice cracking with the mixture of exhaustion and relief as he spotted the first helicopter cresting over the distant ridge. Quito tightened his grip under Richard's shoulder, helping him navigate the uneven terrain as they pushed. Through the final stretch toward the clearing where Quito had carefully arranged a signal out of white stones, meticulously laid out earlier, despite their desperate pace. The rhythmic thump of the rotor blades grew louder as a second helicopter appeared behind the first, both banking in a synchronized arc as they descended rapidly toward the makeshift landing zone. Richard stumbled slightly, nearly losing his footing, but Quito steadied him without a word, his eyes never leaving the aircraft as they settled into position, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and debris that swirled chaotically around them. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open, and a rescue team member jumped out, sprinting toward them with a medical bag in hand while signaling to the others. "Are you injured?" the man shouted, reaching for Richard, but the billionaire immediately held up a hand, gesturing toward Quito beside him. "Him first," Richard said firmly, his voice steady despite his physical weakness. The medic paused for a second, clearly surprised, then turned his attention to Quito, who shook his head sharply and stepped back. "I'm fine," Quito insisted, his voice resolute. Richard leaned heavily on the boy for balance and added, "He saved my life. Twice." The medic nodded, then moved to assess Richard's ankle, carefully unwrapping the makeshift binding Quito had applied earlier and examining the swelling. Another member of the rescue team arrived, helping to support Richard as they guided him carefully toward the waiting helicopter. As they approached the open door, Richard suddenly stopped, twisting his upper body despite the pain to look back at Quito, who stood several meters away, watching silently. "You're coming too!" Richard declared loudly over the roar of the rotors, his expression leaving no room for argument. Quito shook his head again, taking a step back toward the brush. "This is your rescue," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. Richard grimaced in frustration and turned to the medic. "I'm not getting on that helicopter without him," he stated, crossing his arms stubbornly, despite the medic's protestations about his injury and the urgency of evacuation. The lead pilot, now standing just outside the cockpit, approached them quickly, frowning at the delay. "Sir, we need to lift off now. There's no sign of the animal but staying here. Much longer is too dangerous." Richard ignored him entirely, limping past the medical crew and making his way directly to Quito, who stood still as a statue. "Listen," Richard said, leaning heavily against a rock as he addressed the boy directly. "You've done more for me than anyone else ever has. I'm not leaving you here." Quito's eyes flicked to the helicopters, then back to Richard. This is my home," he replied quietly. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he realized the depth of what that simple statement meant. "You deserve more than this," Richard said, gesturing vaguely at the expanse of wilderness around them. "You deserve a chance to learn, to grow, to do whatever you want." Quito tilted his head, studying Richard for a long moment before replying, "Out here, I already know how to survive." Richard smiled sadly, nodding in acknowledgement, but added, "But maybe you deserve to do more than just survive." Quito didn't answer immediately, his gaze turning to the horizon where the Savanna stretched endlessly in every direction, vast and wild and unforgiving. Richard followed his eyes, understanding in that moment how deeply connected the boy was to this land, how much it defined who he was. "I'm not saying you have to stay away forever," Richard continued, his voice softer now. "Come with me, learn what the world out there is like, and if you want, you can always come back." Quito glanced at him, the flicker of curiosity passing through his guarded expression. "You'd take me?" he asked cautiously, as though the very idea was too foreign to believe. Richard chuckled, wincing at the movement. "Quito, I'd be honored to have you." He extended his hand, offering it not as a rescuer, but as an equal. Quito stared at the hand for a moment, then at the helicopters behind them, then finally at the land around him. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and took Richard's hand, allowing the man to pull him gently toward the aircraft. Once inside the helicopter, Quito sat across from Richard, his posture stiff and his eyes wide, as he took in the array of controls and equipment, all so alien compared to the simple tools and instincts he'd relied on his entire life. Richard watched him with a mixture of pride and protectiveness, leaning over slightly and saying, "It's loud, but you'll get used to it." Quito didn't respond, his hands gripping the edge of the seat tightly as the helicopter lifted off, the ground falling away beneath them. For several minutes, neither spoke, both absorbed in their own thoughts as the Savanna receded into the distance. Then Richard cleared his throat and said, "When we get back, I want to talk to some people. Start something. A foundation, maybe." Quito looked at him, confused. "Foundation?" Richard nodded, warming to the idea as he said it aloud. "For kids like you. For the animals, too. To protect this place and to make sure others get a chance to live, to learn. Just like you." Quito considered that quietly, then looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. Several days later, Richard sat in a hospital bed, his ankle in a cast and an IV drip in his arm, as a reporter adjusted the camera in front of him. "We're live in 3, 2, the producer signaled, and then the reporter smiled brightly and said, "We're here with billionaire Richard Langdon, recently rescued from a harrowing ordeal in the African Savanna." Richard smiled faintly, nodding toward the camera. "Yes, but I wasn't alone out there. There was someone who saved my life." The reporter leaned forward. Eagerly, "We've heard rumors of a local boy. Can you confirm?" Richard nodded. "His name is Quito, and he's the bravest person I've ever met." The reporter smiled wider, but Richard's expression turned serious as he added, "That experience changed me, and because of it, I've decided to create the Quito Foundation. It will focus on protecting the wildlife of the savannah and providing education and resources for children like Quito, who live in places where opportunity is scarce." The reporter raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "That's remarkable. And what about Quito? Will he be involved?" Richard smiled fully for the first time. "He'll be coming to live with me to study, but I've promised him he can always come back." Several weeks after the interview, Richard stood outside a modest school building on the edge of his estate, watching as Quito, now dressed in clean clothes and carrying a backpack, approached hesitantly. "This is for me?" Quito asked, his voice tinged with disbelief as he took in the building, the other children, the teachers waiting by the entrance. Richard nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Quito's shoulder. "It's for you, and for anyone else who needs it." Quito looked up at him, then back at the school, then down at the small patch of earth beneath his feet, shifting his weight awkwardly. "It's different," he admitted finally. Richard chuckled. "Yeah, but different isn't bad." Quito nodded slowly, then squared his shoulders and took a step toward the entrance. Richard watched him go, a lump forming in his throat as he realized the boy's journey was only just beginning. Quito paused at the door, turned back to Richard, and offered a small, almost shy wave before disappearing inside. Later that evening, Quito stood alone on the balcony of Richard's home, overlooking the sprawling estate that now served as his new home. In the distance, the city lights twinkled, a stark contrast to the endless, untamed savannah he had left behind. He exhaled slowly, gripping the railing as he thought about everything that had led him here. The tiger, the cave, the escape, and finally, the man who had refused to leave him behind. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings, Quito felt a strange sense of calm. He knew that he wasn't abandoning the savannah. It was still a part of him, etched into his instincts and his memories. But now, he had something else too. A chance, a future he'd never dared to imagine. As he looked out at the horizon, he smiled faintly, then turned back toward the house where Richard was waiting, ready to help him take the next step on this new path they'd forged together. We, here at the channel, create each of these stories with great care, always thinking about you, our dear community who follows along and shares these emotions with us. It takes a lot of work. We research, we write, we revise, all so we can bring you special content that inspires and makes you reflect. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel. That really helps us keep producing stories like this and keeps our community strong and welcoming. Also, feel free to explore the other videos we've prepared with the same dedication and tell us in the comments, what did this story mean to you? Your opinion is so important and truly inspires us to keep going. Thank you so much for your support and for being here with us. See you next time.